Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, August 9th, 2023. An American nurse and her daughter kidnapped in Haiti 2 weeks ago while working for a Christian aid group are released. We'll get the State Department reaction. Ohio voters reject a ballot measure that would have made it harder to amend the state constitution. It's largely interpreted as a big win for abortion rights supporters. We'll talk with Politico's state politics reporter Zach Montellaro about what this means for abortion as an election issue. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican presidential candidate, suspends an elected state attorney, a Democrat, for not being tough enough on crime. We'll hear from both of them. President Joe Biden is at the site of a new wind tower factory not far from Albuquerque, New Mexico, talking about clean energy manufacturing. And also about today's one-year anniversary of the CHIPS and Science Act he signed into law. It's a law that will spend billions of dollars to promote semiconductor chip manufacturing in the United States. And New York City Mayor Eric Adams pleading for more state and federal money to help with the influx of migrants to his city. He estimates the cost of caring for tens of thousands of asylum seekers over 3 years will be $12 billion. A story from NBC News. An American nurse and her child were released nearly 2 weeks after they were kidnapped in Haiti, a nonprofit connected to the woman said Wednesday. It is with heart of gratitude and immense joy that we at El Roy Haiti confirm the safe release of our staff member and friend, Alex Dorsonville, and her child, who were held hostage in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. The group said in a message on its website, "Today we are praising God for answered prayer." She is a community health nurse married to the group's founder and director. She and her child were kidnapped last month from the group's location near Port-au-Prince. More from today's State Department news conference with spokesperson Matthew Miller.
I hope we can dispense with this rapidly. Just on Haiti and the release of the two Americans, do you have anything more to say than the language that came out earlier today?
I will say that we welcome the reports of their release. We have no greater priority, of course, than the safety and security of U.S. citizens overseas. We express our deepest appreciation to our Haitian and U.S. interagency partners for their assistance in facilitating for their safe release, and out of respect for their privacy, we'll let the individuals speak for themselves when they feel ready.
So in other words, the answer was no. You don't have anything to add to what was said before. But I'm just a little bit curious about it. I don't understand. Why do you open it up by saying we welcome reports of the release, and then you go on and thank the Haitians and your other partners for facilitating
we welcome
the release, not the reported release? Why can't you just say yes?
That is a very pedantic quibble, but I think you're right. We welcome their release. Correct.
I don't think it's pedantic at all.
I didn't think you would, but you're right. You're right. I'll edit myself. We welcome their release. Right. Fair point.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller getting questions from Associated Press reporter Matt Lee at today's State Department briefing. A New York Daily News article reads that Port-au-Prince remains one of the most dangerous cities in the world. In July alone, 83 people were kidnapped, according to human rights observers. The State Department has issued a do not travel notice for Haiti, and non-essential personnel have been evacuated from the U.S. Embassy in Port-au-Prince. Gunfire outside the embassy shuttered operations on Tuesday, and restrictions remained in place Wednesday. That from the New York Daily News. From the Israeli news site Haaretz, there's this. The White House threw cold water on a report published Wednesday in the Wall Street Journal regarding an agreement on the general outline of an Israeli-Saudi Arabia normalization deal. On Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. officials in Israel will make concessions to the Palestinians in order to facilitate the agreement. Those same officials estimated that a normalization deal between the two countries can be reached within 9 to 12 months, though the report adds that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is in no rush to reach a deal, shortly after the White House claimed that a general outline has not been agreed upon. That from Haaretz. The White House official doing that was John Kirby, spokesperson for the National Security Council. He got a question at a virtual audio-only news conference today from Reuters reporter Jeff Mason.
John, can you give a sense of where negotiations stand between the U.S. and Saudi with regard to recognizing Israel? This is in relation to the Wall Street Journal report, and also give maybe a sense of where those talks are and what the outcomes are likely to be.
Hey, Jeff, thanks. Look, I think quite frankly, just to be blunt here, I think the reporting has left some people with the impression that discussions are farther along and closer to some sense of certainty than they actually are. The president was approving of an effort by Jake and by Coordinator McGurk, as well as Amos Hochstein, to travel to the region and to see what was in the realm of the possible when it comes to pursuing Israel-Saudi normalization. As we've said before, and I'll say it again, normalization and any sort of agreement towards normalization, that's going to be decided by those two sovereign states. Now, I understand the context of this is that there were other pieces of this in terms of potential incentives to get them there. And all I would tell you is that those discussions are ongoing. We still believe that regional integration is a good thing for the region, good thing for us, good thing for the national security interests of our partners there. But there's still a lot of discussing to happen here. There's still a lot of conversations that have to occur before we get there. So bottom line is there is no agreed to set of negotiations. There's no agreed to framework to codify normalization or any of the other security considerations that we and our friends have in the region. But there is a commitment by the administration to keep talking and to keep trying to move things forward. That is a long answer, but it was and I apologize for that, but I wanted to just kind of lay down the context here because I did see the reporting.
John Kirby is Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council, speaking to reporters on an audio-only virtual briefing. A story from Axios begins that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to get a security agreement with the U.S. focused on deterring Iran in the context of a mega deal the Biden administration is trying to reach with Saudi Arabia and Israel, four Israeli and U.S. officials told Axios. In this story from Al Jazeera, Israel has warned that if war were to break out with Hezbollah, it would result in Lebanon returning, quote, to the Stone Age. The threat issued by Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Tuesday comes after weeks of repeated skirmishes with the armed Iran-backed group on the border area between the two countries. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken welcoming today the awardees of the first Secretary of State's Award for Global Anti-Racism Champions. It's a group of civil society leaders which the State Department writes has courageously advanced the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities and combated systemic racism, discrimination, and xenophobia worldwide. The 2023 awardees come from Brazil, Peru, Bangladesh, Tunisia, Nepal, and Moldova. Here's Secretary Blinken at the State Department.
President Biden has made advancing racial equity and justice for underserved communities, for LGBTQI+ people, people with disabilities, religious minorities, a core priority of this administration. It's why he signed a landmark executive order on his very first day in office, directing the entire federal government to put its full weight and resources behind this imperative, both here at home and around the world. Here at the State Department, we're carrying out an ambitious plan driven by Desiree to embed racial equity into our programs and policies, among other efforts to promote equity. That includes everything from engaging a wider range of stakeholders to ensuring that our foreign assistance programs empower marginalized groups. Our focus reflects what I think is a long overdue recognition that a more equitable foreign policy is also a more effective foreign policy. If entire communities are denied opportunity, that holds back an entire nation's economic potential. When certain groups can't access vaccines and treatment, that hinders our ability to prevent, to detect, to respond to global pandemics. When individuals don't see themselves reflected in the governments that are purported to represent them, that undermines faith in the system and in our democracies. In other words, racism, discrimination, these are not only morally wrong, they make our world less safe, less stable, less prosperous. And that goes directly to the interests of the United States. Our shared goal of advancing racial equity and combating racism, racial and ethnic discrimination, xenophobia, only possible because of the extraordinary courage and commitment of our civil society partners on the front lines. And today, as you heard from Desiree, we wanted to make this an occasion to recognize 6 of these exceptional leaders, representative in so many ways of so many people who are out there every single day with extraordinary courage, extraordinary commitment, extraordinary conviction, but also, as Desiree said, truly exceptional in their own rights.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at today's ceremony at the State Department. A State Department press release says that the Global Anti-Racism Champion awardees will spend the week meeting with U.S. government officials and U.S. civil society leaders to offer expertise and exchange ideas on promoting racial equity and justice in their respective countries. This is Washington Today. Associated Press, Dateline Columbus, Ohio. Ohio voters resoundingly rejected a Republican-backed measure that would have made it more difficult to change the state's constitution, setting up a fall campaign that will become the nation's latest referendum on abortion rights since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned nationwide protections last year. The defeat of Issue 1 on Tuesday keeps in place a simple majority threshold for passing future constitutional amendments rather than the 60% supermajority that was proposed. Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio, was on MSNBC this morning.
This was 4 times the turnout that the Secretary of State had predicted, and the race was overwhelming. I mean, it was clearly a rejection of the power grab of that politicians in Columbus were making, and the voters rejected. Certainly was about abortion, but certainly it was about the corruption in Columbus and the power grab by state officials, and with a huge turnout and a compelling 14-point margin. So that's all good
That's
news
amazing.
for Ohio, and it's a bipartisan effort.
U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio, on MSNBC this morning. Mike Ganadakis, president of Ohio Right to Life, was interviewed on CNN Tuesday night.
This was a battle worth having. We needed to have a decision with the state of Ohio, all 88 counties. Look, do we want to protect our Constitution from outside special interests, whether they be liberal or conservative special interests, or do we want our Constitution to be for sale? Look, in the state of Illinois, they have a 60% threshold to change their Constitution. And we said if it's good enough for the blue state of Illinois, shouldn't it be good enough for the red state of Ohio? Voters will decide tonight, but it was a battle worth having. It was a question we should have all asked tonight, and we did. And the voters will respond, and the voters always get it right.
But is that what it's about? Is it about special interests? Because, I mean, even the Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose said, quote, "This is 100% about keeping a radical pro-abortion amendment out of our Constitution." Did that hurt your efforts here to get this to pass?
No, look, the strength of our side, our yes side, was the diversity of our coalition. For myself and my wife, Amy, of course, 100% about abortion and not enshrining late-term abortion in our state constitution. But our Second Amendment friends were involved, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, the Ohio Farm Bureau. We were all together on this issue tonight and vote yes on Issue 1.
Mike Ganadakis, president of Ohio Right to Life, on CNN Tuesday night. With more on the results from Ohio and the ballot measure and the future of abortion as a voting issue, joining us on the phone is Zach Montellaro, state politics reporter for Politico. Thanks so much for being with us. What lessons should politicians learn from the ballot defeat in Ohio?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So there's a couple of lessons. I think the first and most obvious one is that abortion rights still remains an incredible motivating factor for voters, even when it itself is not directly on the ballot. You know, this week's vote was not specifically about abortion rights. It just turned into a proxy fight around it because of the upcoming vote this November on a ballot measure that is explicitly about abortion rights. But the group that opposed this ballot measure, which would have made it tougher to do future ballot measures, successfully argued to voters in the state that this is actually a precursor to trying to, outlaw abortion in the state. And that argument won. And not only did it win, it won by a pretty huge margin. They had a 14-point victory. Ohio is not the swing state it used to be. The and generalizing here, but the liberal candidates in Ohio haven't sniffed a 14-point victory in a long time. So for the pro-abortion rights side to have that big of a victory was a big deal. And turnout was bonkers. This is an August election, which normally gets very, very low turnout. Turnout on Tuesday was just a little bit shy of what it was for the 2014 midterms. Granted, not a huge turnout midterms, but that just shows how dialed in supporters were for this.
Going forward, where will the abortion issue have the most resonance in this election cycle?
So of course there's Ohio later this year, but that's going to basically stand alone. But when you look towards 2024, there's a couple of other states that are trying to do something similar and put an abortion rights ballot measure on the ballot in 2024. I think the biggest one potentially is Arizona. There was an attempt in the midterms to put one up that didn't get enough signatures. Now the organizers there are starting a lot earlier. Instead of having 2 months to collect signatures, they'll have, about a year. So I would look for one there in Arizona. States like Florida would be a good place to look at too, and expect it to crop up in a couple other states as well that we may not even see the contours of yet.
One of the articles that you've written at Politico.com has a subheading, Anti-Abortion Messaging Isn't Evolving or Resonating. What does that mean?
Yeah, so we've seen anti-abortion groups try the same messaging. This is not the first this is not the first pro-abortion rights ballot measure, I should say. We saw one explicitly in Michigan during the midterms. We saw one that was kind of a bank shot, not explicitly about abortion rights, but was basically about abortion rights in Kansas. And the way that anti-abortion activists and groups talk about these ballot measures, bringing in things like parental rights, sometimes bringing in, the rights of minors and the so-called extremity of, the procedure, it just hasn't resonated with voters. These measures, the pro-abortion rights sides have won pretty hands down, that voters just aren't responding to arguments, especially since, Roe v. Wade was overturned about certain pro-abortion right measures being too extreme. Voters have been saying no, and then passing these pretty handily in many states, at least what we've seen so far.
We're talking with Zach Montellaro from Politico. Which side is making abortion an issue more, Republicans or Democrats?
I think it still remains that Democrats and pro-abortion right groups are leading on the issue. Some very prominent anti-abortion groups have been talking a lot about where they want to see Republican candidates. And I'm thinking about a very prominent group, Susan B. Anthony List, has been pressuring Republican presidential candidates to commit to certain types of policies on abortion. But by and large, on the ground, it's been abortion rights has been a conversation that Democrats have really wholly embraced. In the 2022 midterms, and Democrats did a lot better than expected. And we saw this specifically in governor's races, too. Of course, the battle for Congress, but specifically governor's races. Democratic gubernatorial candidates just wholeheartedly embraced saying that they're going to look to protect abortion rights in their respective states. And by and large, Democratic gubernatorial candidates won in the midterms. We're seeing that now in 2023. Look towards Virginia, for example, where there's going to be state legislative races later this year. Earlier this year in Wisconsin, the liberal state Supreme Court justice talked a lot about abortion rights, while her opponent would have preferred to have not talked about it. And she won in a resounding fashion. So it's liberal candidates, it's Democratic candidates, it's abortion rights groups that have been putting these ballot initiatives on, that have been running on it as part of their platform when they're candidates.
Final question, is this going to change at all in the future, or is this the new normal, that these fights are going to be with us for the foreseeable future?
I think it's interesting to see, as long as these fights remain in the states, it sounds like it's here to stay. There was a recent poll from CNN that found that attitudes over abortion rights have virtually shifted, not even a little bit, since last summer. That a poll in July of 2022 found that 60%, give or take, of American adults disapproved of the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, and 50%, of the majority of American adults, disapproved of it strongly. That was in July 2022. CNN just put out this a similar poll a couple of days ago, the numbers have barely moved. So voters and American adults, I guess specifically in the CNN poll, have not let this issue fade away. Maybe 5, 10, 15 years from now, sure, when there's when some of these issues have been sorted out and there has been some more definitive legislation. But I think at least for now, the elections we've seen since Roe was overturned, the midterms, and then, the Wisconsin election earlier this year, this Ohio ballot measure this summer, have shown that this is still top of mind for voters, even if they don't say in polls that this is their number one issue. This is still it looks to be at least an issue that remains very, very important for voters at least.
Zach Montellaro, state politics reporter for Politico. You can find his stories at Politico.com and on X, formerly Twitter, at Zach Montellaro. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, writes the Washington Post, suspended the Orlando area state attorney Wednesday, saying she was, quote, clearly and fundamentally derelict in her duty. Governor DeSantis of Florida, Republican presidential candidate, removed Monique Worrell, a Democrat, from her job as the chief prosecutor for Florida's 9th Judicial Circuit Court at a brief news conference in Tallahassee. It's the second time in a year that the governor has suspended an elected Democrat from office. That from the Washington Post. And here is Governor DeSantis in Florida's capital city.
The state of Florida is a law and order state. And that means we support the men and women who wear the uniform, who protect and serve. It means we have strong policies to hold criminals accountable for their misconduct. Prosecutors have a duty to faithfully enforce the law. One's political agenda cannot trump this solemn duty. Refusing to faithfully enforce the laws of Florida puts our communities in danger and victimizes innocent Floridians. Accordingly, I am today announcing the suspension of State Attorney Monique Worrell from the 9th Judicial Circuit effective immediately. I'm appointing Judge Andrew Bain to take over as State Attorney for the 9th Judicial Circuit. Judge Bain is currently a judge in Orlando. He is a native Floridian. He attended University of Miami, where he played football, and he received his law degree from Florida A&M Law School, and I trust that he will be a prosecutor that faithfully enforces the law and will keep the communities of Central Florida safe. Monique Worrell's administration of criminal justice in the 9th Circuit has been clearly and fundamentally derelict so as to constitute both neglect of duty and incompetence. The policies or practices listed in our executive order suspending her that constitutes the grounds of suspension are as follows. One, a pattern or practice to avoid minimum mandatory sentences for gun crimes. Pattern or practice to avoid minimum mandatory sentences for drug trafficking offenses. Pattern or practice allowing juvenile offenders to avoid serious charges and incarceration altogether. Pattern or practice to avoid valid and applicable sentencing enhancements. Pattern or practice limiting charges for child pornography. Pattern or practice for seeking withholding of adjudication in situations not permitted under Florida law. Prosecutors do have a certain amount of discretion about which cases to bring and which not. But what this state attorney has done is abuse that discretion and has effectively nullified certain laws in the state of Florida. That breaches her duties that she owes to the people of Florida under our state constitution and provides the basis for the suspension.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a Republican presidential candidate, today in Tallahassee. State Attorney Monique Worrell responded outside the Orange County Courthouse in Orlando.
All right, well, good morning. I think this is the moment we've all been waiting for. If we're mourning anything this morning, it is the loss of democracy. I am your duly elected state attorney for the 9th Judicial Circuit, and nothing done by a weak dictator can change that. This is an outrage. 3 years ago, I was elected by the people of the Ninth Judicial Circuit to lead this circuit. And yes, to do things unconventionally, to do things differently. But I didn't hide. I didn't say that I would do things and I didn't do them. I didn't say I wouldn't do things and not did them. I did exactly what I said I would do, and that is what you want from an elected official. Elected officials are being taken out of office solely for political purposes, and that should never be a thing. There used to be a very high standard for the removal of elected officials. There used to be a standard that I would have had to have been criminally prosecuted for something, neglecting my duties, meaning that I don't show up for work and do my job, or that I had some sort of an illness that prevented me from doing my job. But under this tyranny, elected officials can be removed simply for political purposes and by a whim of the governor. And no matter how you feel about me, you should not be okay with that.
That's right.
This is simply a smokescreen for Ron DeSantis' failing and disastrous presidential campaign. He needed to get back in the media in some positive way that would be red meat for his base, and he will have accomplished that today. He will be in the news nationally and internationally for the individual who has single-handedly destroyed democracy in the state of Florida.
Florida State Attorney Monique Worrell in Orlando after the announcement from Governor DeSantis that she was being suspended. An article at Politico reads that Monique Worrell said that she was exploring potential legal options. She also vowed to continue her plans to run for re-election in 2024. And also in that article, there's this. This is the second time that Governor DeSantis has removed an elected prosecutor from office during his time as governor. He suspended Hillsborough prosecutor Andrew Warren a year ago over several decisions the Democratic elected official made, including signing a pledge that he would not enforce a newly adopted ban on abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Andrew Warren challenged his suspension in both state and federal court, but has been rebuffed so far in his effort to get reinstated. That reporting from Politico. Also today, the Republican National Committee announced that Fox Business will be hosting the second Republican presidential primary debate on September 27th from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. The first Republican presidential primary debate will be televised by Fox News, August 23rd from Milwaukee. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Listening to programs on C-SPAN through C-SPAN Radio just got easier. Tell your smart speaker, play C-SPAN Radio, and listen to Washington Journal daily at 7 a.m. Eastern. Important congressional hearings and other public affairs events throughout the day. And weekdays at 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern. Catch Washington Today for a fast-paced report on the stories of the day. Listen to C-SPAN anytime. Just tell your smart speaker, play C-SPAN Radio. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. President Biden in Belen, New Mexico today, about 30 miles from Albuquerque, talking about clean energy manufacturing. He was at the groundbreaking of a wind tower facility being built by the company Arcosa. He also highlighted the one-year anniversary of his signing into law the CHIPS and Science Act, which, according to the White House, invests almost $53 billion in U.S. semiconductor manufacturing, research, and development. First, the president on wind towers.
In 2008, Solo Cup Factory shut down right here, right where we're standing. 200 people lost their jobs. Nearly a decade and a half later, a plastics company bought the site. It shut down after 3 years, laying off 100 workers. It's been idle ever since. Now it's coming alive again. Arcosa makes wind turbines, wind towers. That's the thing that holds most. When I say that, people look at me like wind tower. You all know what a wind tower is. They look at me like, what the hell's a wind tower? That's a key component. You know, you have to have it to hold up those blades. You know how long, by the way, I was in eastern Colorado looking at the blades manufactured. Those blades are 103 yards long, longer than a football field. And by the way, they don't cause cancer.
President Biden in Belen, New Mexico, not far from Albuquerque. He also spoke about the anniversary of his signing the CHIPS and Science Act into law.
You all know semiconductors are those little small computer chips about the size of any of your fingertip that affect nearly everything in our lives, from cell phones to automobiles, refrigerators, to the most sophisticated weapon system, including the systems that Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories provide for our national security. America invented these chips. We invented them. We went to the moon. We made them work better. We made them more sophisticated. But over time, we went from producing nearly 40% of those chips, the world's chips, down to 10%. That's why I designated and I signed, and I insisted that it be written and passed, the CHIPS and Science Act, exactly almost 1 year ago today, very short. Now, all over the country, semiconductor companies are investing in record billions of dollars. By the way, you know how much has been committed in the CHIPS and Science Act to be invested in America? $230 billion. $230 billion to bring chip production back home in Ohio, New York, Arizona, and right here in New Mexico. Look, just a few years ago, Intel cut 700 jobs at a semiconductor fab in Rio Rancho. Now they're expanding their fab with a $3.5 billion investment, creating 700 new jobs, many of which won't require a college degree. And by the way, of this over $200 billion, they're building fabs. They're just called factories. They're the size of a football field, not much wider than this.
President Biden today in New Mexico. Yesterday he was in Arizona. Tomorrow he'll be in Utah before returning to his home in Delaware. That CHIPS and Science Act, signed 1 year ago today, passed the U.S. House by a vote of 243 to 187, with one member voting present, and the Senate by a vote of 64 to 33. One of the Senate Republicans who voted yes, Todd Young of Indiana, posting on X, formerly Twitter, "A year ago today, the CHIPS and Science Act became law and America went on offense against the Chinese Communist Party. Critical chip manufacturing is returning to the USA with more than $230 billion in private investment announced over the last year." He added a video of himself, and it also includes clips of some of his speeches on the Senate floor.
America went on offense against the Chinese Communist Party in August of 2022. When legislation I worked on for years to out-innovate and out-compete China was signed into law. The legislation went by many titles: the Endless Frontier Act, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, and finally, the CHIPS and Science Act. No matter its name, this legislation was a vision of America's continued leadership in technological innovation, and its enactment was a bold investment in America's national security. I wrote the original version of this bill recognizing that we're in an ongoing global power competition with China. In many crucial areas, Beijing is gaining ground or even ahead of the United States. The world's autocrats are attempting to exert their influence across the globe. You see, this is about deciding which values are going to animate these technologies in the future. The Chinese Communist Party has invested trillions in the frontier technologies that will shape our modern economy and decide the winners of future wars. Technologies like quantum computing, hypersonics, and artificial intelligence. The CHIPS and Science Act provides a significant federal investment to jumpstart semiconductor production here in the United States. These tiny chips bring life to our cell phones, cars, appliances, almost anything with a motor or a plug, including many of our military platforms, weapons, and systems. America makes only 11% of the global supply of semiconductors, And China's investing heavily in semiconductor production. China accounted for less than 4% of the market half a decade ago, but now controls over 20% of the market in 2023. If China produces more and more of the world's supply of semiconductors, America's economy and security could be at the mercy of the CCP, especially in the event of another pandemic or war. After all, 90% of the chips in our military hardware are currently made overseas. This is all part of Beijing's bet to beat America. But the CHIPS and Science Act will help to ensure that America can counter that bet. A thriving domestic chip industry will prevent future supply chain stoppages and safeguard our military readiness. To learn more about the CHIPS and Science Act, visit young.senate.gov/chips.
Senator Todd Young, Republican from Indiana, posting that video, 1-year anniversary of the signing of the CHIPS and Science Act into law. A Yahoo Finance article reads that chip makers are rebuilding the U.S. semiconductor industry with $231 billion in new investments spurred by the enactment of the landmark CHIPS and Science Act a year ago. But even as Biden officials celebrate the anniversary of that legislation this week, there are mounting concerns about whether enough skilled workers will be there to run these factories once they are online. And a story from CNBC, a year after President Joe Biden signed the CHIPS and Science Act into law, the U.S. semiconductor industry is still waiting on the windfall. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo said, "We will start to give out the money later this year. We're pushing the team to go fast, but even more important, to get it right." As mentioned, President Biden traveling to western states this week, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, to tout the parts of his economic agenda that he calls Bidenomics. Some Republicans are seeing things differently. Congressman Tom Emmer of Minnesota, the House Majority Whip, was interviewed on the Fox News Rundown podcast this morning.
The president's Bidenomics spin is clearly not resonating with Main Street America. And it's not resonating, Mike, because it's not true. Literally, by destroying our energy independence on his first day in office, and then by spending trillions of dollars, this president and his administration have driven inflation that we haven't seen in 40 years. Cost of everything is going up. And according to a recent CBS News poll, 65% of Americans said the condition of the economy was bad. 69% said prices have been going up just in the last few weeks, and 70% said that their income from their earnings at work just isn't keeping up with inflation. So the Biden administration is either lying, outright lying, trying to spin something that's not true, or they're completely ignorant. Either way, it's bad for the American people, and they'll answer for it at the ballot box next year.
Congressman Tom Emmer, Republican from Minnesota, this morning on the Fox News Rundown podcast. He is the U.S. House Majority Whip. The House and Senate are continuing their summer recess. They are back in early September. Wall Street today, the Dow down 191, NASDAQ down 162, and S&P down 31. From the New York Times, this article, for a year now, Mayor Eric Adams has been sounding the alarm about a humanitarian crisis like few New York City has ever seen before, as tens of thousands of migrants arrive from the southern border. On Wednesday, he made yet another plea for federal help and cited a staggering new cost estimate, $12 billion to house and care for the newcomers over the course of 3 years. By way of comparison, the city's most recent annual budget is $107 billion. That from the New York Times. Here's Mayor Adams, a Democrat, in New York City.
For each family seeking asylum through the city's care, we spend an average of $383 per night to provide shelter, food, medical care, and social services. With more than 57,300 individuals currently in our care on an average night, that amounts to $9.8 million a day, almost $300 million a month, and nearly $3.6 billion a year. But this is the floor, not the ceiling. This is only an estimate if the number of migrants in our care stays the same over time. It is clear to us, however, that without policy changes, the number of migrants arriving will continue to grow. This will increase our costs. If we continue down this unsustainable track with an average of almost 34,000 households a night over the course of just this fiscal year, that will increase costs to $4.7 billion. Hear me. If things do not change, our new estimates have us spending nearly $5 billion on this crisis in the current fiscal year. That's up from the $1.4 billion we spent last fiscal year, and it nearly equals the budgets of Sanitation Department, our Parks Department, and the FDNY combined. And if things do not change, we expect to have more than 100,000 asylum seekers in our care by the end of June 2025, driving projected spending to $6.1 billion in that fiscal year if we do not change course. That means over the course of 3 fiscal years, our city is projected to have spent more than $12 billion. To meet this need, we will have to add $7 billion to our financial plan. And this is on top of what we previously allocated for the crisis. This is the budgetary reality we are facing if we don't get the additional support we need from the federal and state governments.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams, a Democrat, today in New York City. The New York Daily News also reporting that he said we're past the breaking point and that it breaks the city's heart that dozens of migrants resorted a few weeks ago to sleeping on a midtown Manhattan sidewalk after being told there was no more room in the city's overcrowded shelter systems. And also due to the ballooning price tag, Mayor Adams said his administration is in the process of scaling back services being offered to migrants in the city's care. Perks like free meals, laundry, and hygiene products are likely to be on the chopping block. That from the Daily News. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories being talked about in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.